I was with a client earlier this week, and I was having a really interesting conversation with them. And I thought afterwards, we need to do this as a podcast. Yeah. And so let me set the scene for you. I got called into this client who, over the last couple of years, had been trying to improve their customer experience. And it was. I mean, it's good stuff. But they'd done a lot of the low-hanging fruit. Okay, they'd improved this process, they'd done that, but they weren't making the breakthroughs that they thought that they should. Okay, and when I started to chat to them, what I realized was that they had focused their attentions on the front-facing staff, the
So the people
front-facing
actually
teams.
engaged with customers.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense.
So absolutely, and again, as part of the overall plan, and as part of trying to get things off the ground. Not saying that you should do everything all at once. It's impossible to do everything at once. However, if you're trying to create a breakthrough, if you're trying to change the culture of the organization, you can't have one group of people with a mindset that looks customer centric and another group of people in the same organization that aren't, because you get this conflict between the two with the policies and the procedures that just end up butting heads with each other. Yeah.
So it's almost like some organizations will like have a corporate culture and then they'll just kind of paper over the top of it with like customer experience, customer centricity.
That's a good way of describing it.
They end up like an apple where it's just like kind of skin deep, but like
and I would to reinforce your analogy, I would argue that what they're doing is they're painting a smiley face on the outside of it, so it looks good, and they're friendly in the main. The people that are talking to the customer and everything else, but and this, I like the apple actually. At the core,
right?
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah.
Okay, or they haven't addressed that. Okay. And this is, in my view, fairly common.
Yeah.
Okay. And when I wrote my first book back in 2002, one of the phrases that I used in there, which I still like, is what I call deep staff.
Yeah. So not deep state, but deep staff.
No, this was pre all the conspiracy theories and everything else that come up. Yeah, but deep staff. So in other words, the people in the back office, and I'm specifically, and will specifically in this podcast refer to HR, IT, finance, all of those parts of the organization that don't touch the customer. And in my experience, having done this for a few years now, when you talk to them, they go, "We don't affect the customer. Nothing to do with us.
Not our problem.
That's that lot out there. They do that." Yeah. And particularly when you start to turn around to them and say, "We are going to have one measure," or not one measure, we're going to have measures on customer experience that you in finance, HR, IT are going to be responsible for because you contribute to them. And in my view, you're paid money against. Yeah. If the company doesn't achieve this, that's when they start to run a mile. Is this all making sense?
It is. I mean, I made a deep state joke, but I think there's a parallel there, right? I mean, the conspiracies about deep state are about like elements of a government that are kind of like below the bureaucracy, the people who are deep inside, who are kind of combating against change or combating against, kind of what others in the organization want to do. And it's kind of a similar idea where, you've got people within the organization who are in favor of inertia, who are fighting change, who kind of don't want things done. So yeah, I think that's a really important insight, that if you want customer centricity, should be a philosophy of an entire business. It should be a philosophy of
Yes.
the company, not of
Yes.
certain departments within the company.
Yes, absolutely. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to run through some areas that I think. So, when you're talking to HR, when you're talking to IT, when you're talking to finance, and they say, no, we've got nothing to do with customer experience, we don't affect it, then I'm going to give you some thoughts of how you can turn around and go, but you do because you do these things. Okay.
That's great.
And in that whole sort of change process, the first thing is they've got to realize what they do and how it affects the customer, which I think is key.
I
So
love that. So this is a deep staff proselytizing guide. This is your missionary tool to reach the deep staff and convert them.
absolutely.
I love
And
it.
let me give you one insight before we start, in case I forget to mention this later. We did a lot of work with Ricoh printers up in Canada, and they have been one of our sort of big case studies. And they improved their Net Promoter Score by 34 points over a 30-month period, and that was in a they increased their revenue by 10% in the declining printer market. Okay. So really achieved some really good stuff. Now, why do I tell you all this? I always remember sitting down with the CEO and talking to him it was over a period of about 5 years. And, as we got into sort of fourth or fifth year, I said to him, what was the one thing that you would have done differently? Yeah. And he, without hesitation, said, the thing I would have done differently is I would have put a customer experience target on everybody in the organization, including everybody in HR, IT, etc. He said, because he said at the beginning, I didn't do that because there was a lot of pushback and everything else. He said, but after we'd overcome all of that and we gave it to them, that really made us rock and roll. And really made us, start to improve our experience. And that goes back to this experience that I've been talking about this week, or this client I've been talking about this week. Yeah, you can make some headway. Yeah, you can improve things, but you can't really get to improving your Net Promoter Score by 30 points over a 30-month period unless you've got the whole organization aligned to you. Does it
I
make
love
sense?
it. Yeah, it's great.
Okay. So HR. So here's the question. HR, how do HR affect the customer experience? Well, guess what? They're in charge of recruitment and talent acquisition. Okay. So we joked earlier about doing having your apple and having that wrapped around it and having a smiley face on it. Well, actually, the type of people you recruit is really important to improve your customer experience. So guess what? HR really affect the customer experience from a recruitment and talent acquisition. So we spoke earlier about the fact that you have an apple and you have the outer rim and you create a smiley face. Well, yeah, you need to improve. You need to employ the right type of people. Okay, and who's in charge of recruitment? Yeah, and talent acquisition. Well, guess what? It's HR. Okay, so they absolutely affect the customer experience.
I mean, we've
That
talked before about training and having the proper training in place. HR is also in charge of that, but we've also talked about how there are certain things you can't train, and you
sure,
need to have the right people in the right roles. And so yes, like both aspects of that do boil down to HR.
yeah, and you just said another important area: training. Okay, who's in charge of training? Guess what? It's HR. So, what's the training that you are giving people? Okay, I always remember going into a call center, um, and I said, "Could you tell us what training do you give people?" And they say, "Oh, we give people 10 weeks worth of training." Okay, That's interesting. And how much of that do you do on soft skills training? Oh well, we do half a day, on soft skills training and how to deal with customers out of 10 weeks. So it's just madness. So you've absolutely got to make sure that the training has got customer experience again fed through all of it. Another massively important area that HR deal with is employee engagement. So the employee experience. Okay, we all know happy customers make happy happy employees make happy customers. So
Well,
employee
actually, the
engagement.
reverse too, right? So there, ideally,
Yeah,
there's this virtuous cycle. But yes, starting with
yeah,
the happy employees is generally the
yes,
place to start.
yes. And the employees need to be the right type of employees that like talking to the customers, and therefore again it always ends up in this virtuous circle. Um, we all know what gets measured gets done, yeah, and what gets paid for gets done even more. Okay, so what are the performance metrics? And guess who's in charge of all of those types of things? Yeah. The HR are there to make sure that the performance metrics are the right type of metrics and then, done within the right way and everything else. I'm not going to rattle through every single one of these, but let me just give you some of these as a for instance. Conflict resolution. If you've got one group of people against another people, HR need to be taking effect. Employee retention. You go into some call centers, they've got 40% turnover. I mean, it's madness. And are we saying that HR's got nothing to do with that? Yeah. Well, of course they have. Incentive programs, internal communication. This is another big one for me. The amount of internal communications that I see that does not talk about the customer, I think is astounding. The best examples I see of internal communication is where it's effectively starts off by talking about the customer or customer experience, and certainly it all wraps around that as the common thread, rather than these other things. I mean, they could be missions and virtues and values, etc. I mean, there's another classic example, actually, just values. How does the customer are they built into them? I'm conscious, mate. I'm on one of my rants, so
I'm trained enough at this point to know to stand back and let you run out of steam so I don't get injured. No, this is a really helpful list. I mean, I don't want to interrupt the head of steam you've built up here, but it strikes me as you're going through this that these are only a problem because of this kind of first ordered thinking. Like, I understand my job in this case as an HR professional, and my
yeah,
job is these tasks. And,
yeah,
and to the extent that there's a conflict then between people saying that they're not involved in the customer centricity
sure,
effort, it's because they're not thinking about the implications of any of these tasks. Like, of
yeah,
course, if you're involved in talent acquisition, like the people that you're hiring are then going to be interfacing with the customers. It's just one
yeah,
extra step to think about the implications of what you're doing.
sure,
Yet I think that for a lot of corporate cultures, that's the way people are managed. That's the way they're incentivized to think. We create these silos. We don't want to step on anybody's toes. And so it's very natural for us to like just consider our own domain and then not think like the next half step forward of what are the
yeah,
implications of what we're doing there. So it suggests that there's opportunity there to like just okay, and then what happens after you hire the
sure,
person? Like what's there? But to your point, I think that it's very, very common. This is my domain, and I assume as you go through the other functions in the business, it's going to be a similar issue. That it's
yeah,
not a huge logical leap to point out that this is going to have implications. It's just
yeah. I
people don't do that for themselves.
I think it's what they're not doing
Yeah,
is these groups are not thinking about it or understanding the context in which they're doing their job. Okay, so something people don't talk about very much nowadays is service profit chains. Do you know service profit chains? But in other words, again, you can map out. You've got the customer at one end. You've then got the frontline people. Whether it's customer service, sales, whatever it may be, but they're backed up by all these other groups of people: management, HR, IT. But ultimately, what the organization is trying to do is to sell their product or service. I would argue that what they are trying to do is to deliver a customer experience. So, to use another case study that we talk about, Maersk Line improved their net promoter score by 40 points over a 30-month period that led to a 10% rise in shipping volumes. And they wanted to, we worked with them to set the strategy in place to, so their experience was they wanted trust, cared for, and pleased. They want the customer to feel that they trust them. They wanted to feel that the customer felt they cared for and they felt pleased. Okay. Why am I telling you this? Because all parts of the organization should be turning around and saying, how do we help achieve that? So HR, recruitment.
Yep.
How are you going to recruit people who are naturally good at creating trust or feeling cared for? Yeah. How are you going to train people to embed those principles into the training? How are you going to create the employee environment where the employee experience that is based around trust, cared for, and pleased? How are you going to incentivize people to create the right incentives and everything else that's trust, care for, and pleased? How are you going to make sure that in your internal communications that trust, cared for, and pleased are embedded in that communication? You get the idea. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you'll indulge another metaphor, a lot of us just have our heads down, focused on the task in front of us, right? Looking straight down
Yes.
at our desk. I think what you're arguing for is it's important to look up and see kind of the goal that all of those things are leading towards. We're not just doing
Yes.
the job and doing it well. We're doing it for some larger purpose that
Yes.
is integrated across the entire organization.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
that purpose is an apple
Yes. An apple
with the
covered
smiley
with a smiley
face.
face. So let's go on and talk about finance, because we're going to end up having a show that's going to last an hour and a half if we're not careful. So again, let me give you some of the headlines. So again, put it into context. How does finance affect the customer experience? How should they be making that context? Okay. Well, guess what? They're in charge of budgets. Budgets have a significant effect on whether you can afford the technology, how much money is spent in different areas. So they own the budget for customer experience, for customer service, etc. I always remember. I've got to tell too many anecdotes here, but this is a good one. I always remember going into pitch for some business with a courier company, and I was sitting there waiting in the foyer with the team. And as I was waiting in the foyer, I noticed that the foyer was being refurbished. Went upstairs, went into the executive, the C-suite, presentation to the CEO, etc., etc., etc. We got to the numbers of how much it would cost to run the program that we were suggesting, and they basically started to push back on the numbers. Okay, I asked them
I
one
see where
question.
this is going.
Yeah, I asked them one question. How much was that refit going to cost? How much was that? And how does that affect the customer experience? It may affect, a one or two customers that come into their head office and see it, but how much does that actually affect the customer experience? So the allocation of budget is done by finances. The investment in technology is done by finance. The cost benefit analysis, and this is a really important area, is done by finance. One of the best things I ever did was when I was running my customer experience program when I was in corporate life was I got somebody from the finance team to sit on my team that was part of my team. So they could qualify everything we did in financial terms to the finance department. And classic question: if you and I'd really like it to hear if people do this or not, because I don't think many people do. A 1% increase in net promoter or whatever measure you've got is worth how much in your organization? Can you equate that? Most organizations can't. And it's, for me, that's finance's job to agree what that looks like.
Yeah. Cost benefit analysis sounds like something very cut and dried, like very easy. We're going to compare this number to that number. In reality, there's a lot of subjective decisions that need to be made in terms of how costs are accounted for,
Correct.
what counts as a benefit, how are we going to estimate that, and having an ally on those decisions, not to bias them, but to make sure that they are fully accounting for everything that should be included, can make or break a program.
Yeah, and here's another example of one that I frequently use with clients. They turn around and say, well, can you show the benefit of this? And one of the things I always say is, do you do leadership training? And they say, yeah. Tell me, what's the financial benefit of leadership training? Tell me the ROI you get from leadership training. And clearly they can't, okay? But they know it's the right thing to do, yeah? So it's getting that sort of mentality there. Anyway, pricing strategy, okay? And we've talked about pricing over the period of time. Customer profitability analysis. I think I've told you in the past that when I was back in corporate life, the largest customers we had, we effectively were making a limited amount of profit from. Yeah. Why? Because we used to put so much resources into them. And what we found was the customers that complained the most, we ended up putting more resources in and they were unprofitable. Okay. So being able to do that profit analysis, and another area which I think is really important, building into that, which finance are responsible for, customer lifetime value. So you're not just looking at a customer from what revenue are they going to give us this year? What revenue are they going to give us next year? But understanding and building into all of these models that a customer lifetime value is worth X, and therefore when we're making investments in et cetera, is important. And and various different customer initiatives. All those things affect the customer. Make sense?
Yeah. So when finance tells you they've got nothing to do with the customer, you've now got a handy list that you can point out to them.
Absolutely.
Very much affect the customer experience.
Absolutely. So let's get on to legal, because now legal is, and again, another area where they would say customers, nothing to do with us. So the contract clarity. So particularly in the B2B side of things, the danger is that you're very customer centered, and then you legal come in and they give customers these bloody contracts that are 59 million pages long and are very oppressive. Yeah. So again, it's the difference between chalk and cheese between the account manager that sold something, yeah, and the sales teams that have agreed to all these things, and then legal come along and go, no, it needs to be this, it needs to be that, etc.
Yeah, just yesterday in class, I taught a case about a hypothetical case about a dry cleaner who lost some clothes, and they needed to figure out how to compensate the employee or not. And we had a discussion about, how generous or stingy should your returns policies be, or your cases where there's a service failure, how should you compensate? And if you leave that up to legal, there's a very good chance that they will write an extremely strict policy because they see their job as protecting the company. Yes. And I tried to persuade my students that this is part of the customer experience, and yes, you've got to write policies that are either going to be too generous or too stingy. That's just the way
Yes.
the world works. And you need to make a marketing level decision.
Yes.
Which of these fits our business model? Which of these, fits one of
Yes.
these policies is going to generate a lot more negative word of mouth than the other.
Yes.
Is that something we can sustain or not? So yeah,
So
but ultimately, whatever you decide, it needs to run through legal, and so they need to
yes.
be on board.
So let's go back to the Maersk Line: trust, cared for, and pleased. How can you create the contract? So should legal be doing things to protect the organization? Yes. It would be naive to turn around and say that they shouldn't. But there needs to be a balance. And if the organization has strategically set the goal that they are trying to create an experience with their customer that evokes trust, cared for, and please, as with Maersk Line, guess what? That needs to be reflected in the contracts. It needs to be reflected in the regulatory compliance. It needs to be reflected in the product liability. It needs to be reflected in the marketing and advertising compliance. And it needs to be reflected in the data privacy compliance. All of those things. Okay. And therefore, again, in each of those areas I've just articulated, then those are the areas where legal have an impact on the customer experience. Going to quickly rattle through the last one, but this is an important one, and this is IT. Okay. And it's becoming an increasingly important area. And IT increasingly are becoming a pivotal part of the customer experience. Because guess what? How do they affect the customer experience? Well, who runs the website? Who sorts out all the apps? Who runs the customer relationship management systems that are in place? How do you deal with the data security? What's the technical support of the product? Where does chatbots and AI fit in? And again, as we move into this world of AI, clearly it's going to be all down to the IT area to make these happen. Just think of the big initiatives that have happened over the last few years in digital transformation. What are the analytical tools that are being used, and how customer friendly are those? What are the processes that are being built? Are you just taking a manual process that you've had and automating it in some way? So, and what are the various different channels that you've got, and how are you integrating the databases? I mean, again, we've talked about this on previous podcasts about AI, but one of the dangers with AI is that all different parts of the organization are doing their own little version of AI, and they're doing it based upon their data structure that's just within their own organization. Who is it that should be pulling all of that information together? It's IT. So again, IT, in my view, are becoming a much more front and center part of the organization that absolutely affects the customer experience.
No,
Make
I
sense?
agree. I'm sure we could both rattle off examples of digital transformations that from the outside look like they were IT run, and those that look like they were customer centric in their decisions.
Yeah.
Right? You get
Yeah.
a lot of apps that are kind of bloated and chock full of features that nobody needs, and that makes them very confusing. And then you've got some that very clearly we're focused on how can we make the lives of our customers better and solve their problems more efficiently.
Yes. Yes.
And those are night and day when you look at them.
Yeah, I always love. There's a video that we used in a newsletter a few months ago of Steve Jobs talking about technology and where you should start. And one of the things that he said, rightly so, is you should start at the customer experience and work your way back. And that's exactly what we're saying. So let me try and round this all up together. Without, and this is exactly what I said to this client this week, which is without changing these deep staff and without looking at HR, IT, finance, legal, etc., you will never truly achieve customer centricity and truly make those, truly make the transformation that you need to. And the first step of the journey is you've got to let those groups know how they affect the experience. Okay. And going back to Ricoh CEO, you've got to also start to get them to or be measuring them against the achievement of the experience that you're trying to deliver. And these are hopefully just been some interesting areas for you to understand, and how you can start to explain to these parts of the organizations how they improve their experience.
Yeah, and if I can summarize,
you want to add?
Yeah, if I can summarize what Colin was talking about, the deep state is out to steal your children, and therefore you need to arm yourself. This idea that customer centricity is an organizational philosophy. It's not a philosophy for various departments within an organization. This isn't something that can be owned by one group. This should be the focus of the entire company. There's a great quote from Peter Drucker that I just looked up. He said, because the purpose of a business is to create a customer, the business enterprise has two and only two basic functions: marketing and innovation. I would include within marketing customer experience. Marketing and innovation produce results. All the rest are costs. Marketing is the distinguishing, unique function of a business. So again, your purpose for your business is to serve customers. Like, that's why you're there. You're not a finance organization. You're not an IT organization. You're not an HR organization. The organization is there to serve customers, and so fundamentally, that is everybody's job. If you need backup on this, go to Google Scholar and type in customer centricity and financial returns, or customer centricity and stock returns, or financial performance. There's research out there. There are academics who do this research, and they find over and over again that there is a huge connection. We had Fred Reichelt on a couple months ago, and he talked about an investment strategy where he just was investing in companies that performed well on his customer centricity metric, and it was vastly outperforming the market on that. And he's, his argument was this was not a fluke, that if you look at companies who do this well, they do better over time. And so there's evidence to be brought to bear to convince people that this is true. But in order for it to succeed, it needs to be a company-wide effort.
Absolutely. Yeah, very well said. Good. Well, I hope that's been of use to you, and we look forward to talking to you next week. Thanks very much for listening. Cheers. Thanks so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode.